Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And once again, I'm rising in this House on behalf of the residents of Calgary Centre, but also on behalf of Canada's finance industry and others in Canada who are lamenting the disastrous course our country is on as we dither away our national advantages. And finding better economic solutions for Canadians is what I sought to do as a representative in this House. It's a focus. It builds on career expertise. It is part of my party's fundamental path forward here to fix these budgets. But in order to fix these budgets have to want to be fixed, to put it lightly. Pardon me, Madam Speaker, I'm just timing myself here. Make sure I don't go over time. But here I am again looking at a brick of legislative changes along with a self-congratulating narrative about all the great outcomes Canada is experiencing. Not so much. The bromides that came with the minister's speech on this latest tumble into economic irrelevance might play well for ostriches, but for anyone paying attention, there's actually very bad economic news. I don't want to spend a whole speech on the nonsense pats in the back this Minister of Finance delivers in her own performance review, but I would be remiss in not publicly rebuking at least some of the financial fiction that she uses to build a case that Canada is somehow doing well economically, all while real GDP is down, all while GDP per capita is down. And the minister seems to like the debt to GDP measure, and her target not to be exceeded over 2 years ago now was 40%. Although this number alone was much higher than it has been in years, that number becomes less relevant with each budget cycle that runs that ratio higher. Here again, in this fall economic statement, it's up to 42.7% in the near future. That ratio, by the way, is irrelevant for anything but comparison purposes with other countries that are going broke. And the minister and her government colleagues seem to like to even change that metric so that it suits their ends and looks good comparatively. How did they do this? I'm sure with ample support from a litany of bureaucrats. They add back the holdings in Canada's pension plans to their net debt numbers. The CPP, Canada Pension Plan, and the QPP, the Quebec Pension Plan. That's about a total of $700 billion. None of that belongs to the government. It is managed at arm's length for the benefit of Canadians. So taking a $1.3 trillion debt, federal only, and taking away more than half that debt from the pockets of Canadian retirees is a nice trick calculation. There's always an offsetting rule in finance. If the government uses Canadians' retirement savings to offset its own debt, that leaves a liability owed to Canadians that will be unfulfilled. The $700 billion is not a free pool of funds to address growing government debt. It belongs to Canadians who have contributed and are counting on those funds for their retirement. One thing you find out from Canadians very quickly, if they find out their governments are actually trying to mess with their retirement savings, you're offside. This year, this government is again increasing the amount that Canadians need to give from their paychecks to the CPP, an effective increase in a payroll tax. This is not the only way that this government is changing the availability of pensions. In this fall economic statement, the government is changing the way that pensions are allowed to operate. There are a couple of very important changes to pension oversight. Pensions will now be overseen by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, OSFI, we call it. That's a federal regulatory body designed to ensure that Canada's banks are operating with the interests of the Canadian financial system and financial consumers in mind. Why? Because OSFI is overseeing a move to be this government's agency in charge of moving our country's financial system to a new norm of green finance, otherwise known as sustainable finance. Now, you know, Madam Speaker, I've seen a lot of finance in my career on both sides of transactions, investor and agent. All of these moves toward green finance and sustainable finance are just ways of altering who gets paid from whom, as in, who is the taxpayer subsidizing to make money? The Minister of Finance openly states in this fall economic statement that Canada is a leader in green finance, a leader in subverting financial math, like the outcome changes if you just tweak the math a little bit, There is no secret math that makes this work. There's only payers and payees, those that get the funds and those that give the funds. This government has been relentless in doling out funds for industrial strategy, but the equation does not change. And the irreversible law in finance is always follow the money. The money flows right into the pockets of this government's friends. This needs to end. We need to fix these budgets. Our job here is to fix these budgets. Let me give you an example, because my colleagues across the way will want it, of what actual sustainable finance is. And I'll refer to a company in Calgary called Enbridge. Very good company, by the way. Sustainable finance, they set their metrics about how they're actually going to perform for their investors' aims. And that allowed them to reduce their cost of capital by about 25 basis points. That means if they hit a number of metrics along the way, including DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, in their board, in their makeup, everything else that their investors were looking for, their investors in that bond were willing to accept 25 basis points less than the market rate in order to be there. That's what we call sustainable finance. And Enbridge is a Canadian leader in that sustainable finance mechanism. It has nothing to do with equity. It has to do with market debt and getting a bit of a premium there, a bit of a discount to the investors about how they can actually participate and move the needle. But those funds are few and far between. Enbridge has been very good at making sure that they meet those requirements and serve that market well. What I want to talk about in this budget, as opposed to just criticisms, is the Canada Growth Fund, and it's an element, as you know, in this fall economic statement. 15 billion new dollars. No organization, no way of actually saying what its mandate is, nothing that compels it to do anything outside of pool $15 billion of funds and spend it on behalf of this government. To do what exactly? Well, not what the Canadian Infrastructure Bank does, and I heard my colleague across the way complain about our position that we're going to do away with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Not a secret. Secret agenda, you called it. Not what the Strategic Investment Fund does, billions of dollars going out to chosen industrial strategies that are accomplishing what in the long run? Not with the layers and layers of government support to fudge economic numbers, to push into new economic opportunities, in which we have, as Canadians, no economic advantage, and we are following other countries that have much more expertise in these sectors. As in, let's pretend Canada's economic advantage currently isn't real, and move to a fiction that we have a different economic advantage. And let's spend, so far, $135 billion in the effort. Now, back to the Canada Growth Fund. $7 billion of that $15 billion is being allocated towards carbon contracts for difference. The new subsidy du jour, we'll say. And I don't know if any of the bodies on that side of the House even understand how that works, but let me try and explain. Contracts for difference hail from the financial world. They help to hedge against volatile prices, e.g. for shares or commodities. The seller and the buyer agree on a strike price for a certain product at a certain time. If the agreed price is below the market price at that time, the buyer has to pay the seller the difference between the agreed price and the market price. If the market price is higher than the strike price, the opposite happens. The seller has to pay the difference to the buyer. So this instrument is a good way of alleviating some of the risks of investing. Unfortunately, it has many risks associated with it as well, and those risks have been detailed in many jurisdictions. Such socialized subsidies could lead to short and long-term distortions, reducing the effectiveness of the price signal as an operational and investment decision driver. In energy and emissions markets, market participants can already use the available short and long-term trading patterns, but additional support for low-carbon technologies is already granted through several instruments aiming to mobilize funding. And I will reiterate, this government has numerous instruments along the way, all of which are failing Canadians and making us much more expensive to do things in Canada. What is the accomplishment? The accomplishment is moving our industries offshore and making Canada less competitive in the world stage. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions and comments? The Honourable from the PM.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I listened attentively to the Honourable Member's speech and his background in the financial sector. My question to him is that the inflation, the interest rates. Many people in Canada, they seem to think that is all the responsibilities or shortcomings of the federal government. Does it not appreciate that the inflation rate is global inflation rate? All the G7 countries are experiencing that. Interest rates are high in every single G7 country. And compared to many other G7 countries, our economic growth, including the latest, I think yesterday or today it came out, the November GDP growth rate shows that we will not go into recession, but we are going to manage a soft landing. Does it not agree that Canada is doing pretty well compared to our G7 partners in all the metrics of inflation rate, the interest rates, and the economic growth that we are witnessing here? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Calgary Centre.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question. I don't know what economic data he's looking at, but when I look at shrinking GDP in Canada, shrinking GDP per capita, shrinking GDP across the board, real GDP, I'm saying that that's the worst in the world. That's the worst in our competitive countries. We actually are doing worse economically. We're trying to cover that up by bringing more people into Canada, which of course will increase our GDP. But our GDP per capita is sinking like a rock as a result. So we're not doing well economically, and it's part of what the financial fiction that this government keeps putting forward is, it's not working well. Interest rates are high in Canada. Interest rates are high in many places, partly because of financially failed experiments that this government continues to push towards. If they don't think the carbon tax and the carbon contracts for difference and everything else they're throwing at the wall in order to make everything more expensive in Canada isn't having its own unique effect on inflation, then they're not watching the ball. You've got to do away with all this excess tax you're putting on the backs of Canadians.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député Jonquière.
Merci. J'apprécie beaucoup mon collègue. Et j'écoutais son discours et en introduction, il nous parlait comment les conservateurs sont fantastiques pour redresser le budget, pour l'équilibre budgétaire. Oui. Et puis, il nous a parlé abondamment aussi de la taxe carbone. Mais moi, il y en a une taxe carbone que je vois, une vraie taxe carbone, Madame la Présidente. Et c'est celle que l'ensemble des Canadiens paient à l'industrie pétrolière. 30 milliards pour un pipeline, des milliards, 12,5 milliards qu'on va donner aux industries pétrolières pour la séquestration, captation de carbone. Et le chef de mon collègue dit fréquemment, pour $1 de dépenses, il va falloir trouver $1 d'économie. Je me demande comment ils vont arriver à équilibrer le budget en étant autant complaisants avec les grandes pétrolières. Peut-être que mon collègue peut nous instruire là-dessus.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Oui, je remercie mon collègue pour la question. C'est intéressant parce que la subvention qu'on donne aux industries pétrolières, c'est presque rien. Il y a beaucoup des autres industries canadiennes qui reçoivent beaucoup de subventions, 135 milliards de dollars pour l'industrie électrique, mais qui va payer pour ça? C'est l'industrie des ressources naturelles qui paye pour ça maintenant. Principalement l'industrie pétrolière qui paye beaucoup de taxes, beaucoup de royautés au gouvernement et autres choses comme ça. C'est l'industrie des ressources naturelles qui paye maintenant pour les cibles du gouvernement dans les autres secteurs on va payer pour plusieurs années. Et à quel bout, je ne sais pas. Parce que maintenant, on donne 4 millions de dollars par travailleur pour l'industrie électrique véhicule. C'est trop et il faut qu'on empêche ça. Merci beaucoup.
Question, l'honorable député de New Westminster, Burnaby.
Always like hearing from my colleague and friend, but I have two questions for him. First off, Stephen Harper, in the dismal decade when he was in power, put in place a series of sweetheart tax haven treaties that the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer says costs us over $30 billion a year. That's $300 billion over the last decade. Are Conservatives prepared now finally to apologize for having gutted the federal budget in that way? And my second question is regarding all the votes we saw in December, where Conservatives voted to cut food safety, air safety, health care, affordable housing, national defense, the RCMP, 120 votes to gut all the services that Canadians depend on. Have Conservatives finally realized that that was a mistake to make those proposals and to have those votes to gut all of those important Canadian programs?
Sir, from the honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Governments, like everything, like everybody, like every household, like every entity, needs to balance their budgets. When governments get out of control and spend too much and rack up too much debt, it leads to too much interest. It leads to too much being paid for the cost of that interest, which comes out of the pockets of Canadians. This is excess funding. Governments have to get back to a cycle where they're actually balancing their budgets by a 5-year cycle or even year by year. But the ability to kind of foist today's taxes onto tomorrow's taxpayers is wrong. And it's going to continue to be wrong, and it's going to continue to mount under this government. It needs to stop. We intend to stop that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.